Hey there, folks. Welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. So glad to have you with us this afternoon for another installment. I'm so glad to have with us, and I love every time I can say this, the person who wrote the book on it. So we have the author who's going to talk about her book, talk about taking a look at Reconstruction through the lens of stabilization. Really fascinating stuff. Before we get into the program, though, I would love to be able to do a mic check with our guest, Miss Diane Chido. So, Diane, if you can you give me a 1 2 1 2, please?
1 2 1 2.
Fantastic. I can hear and see you. Folks, while we're getting that thumbs up from our JES colleagues, friendly reminder, the comment section of this Facebook post is open. So we're going to take your questions, your comments. Just leave them in the comment section below if you're watching live. We'll try to get to as many of those after Diane presents as we can. Of course, if you're watching or listening to a later broadcast, we still welcome those questions and want to be able to hear from you. Diane, I'm getting the thumbs up, so I'm going to start recording and we're going to get right to the program. Folks, she has a wonderful slide deck. We're going to get through that and we're going to take those questions at the end. Sound good, Diane?
Sounds great. Thanks, Ben.
Fantastic. The U.S. Army was tasked to stabilize the former Confederate states after the Civil War. This was the beginning of continued use of our military to conduct nation building at home and then repeatedly abroad to the present day. Until Reconstruction was halted by a corrupt backroom deal only 12 years after the end of hostilities, the Army achieved Herculean success in integrating 4 million newly freed people and attempting to remake a new South with the end of slavery, that peculiar institution. Once the Army retreated, the old Southern political powers returned to their old posts and their old animosities and worked diligently to reverse the gains made by American citizens of African descent. Those efforts resulted in Jim Crow laws and a century of disenfranchisement, incarceration, and economic oppression that continue to plague society today. If the moment has finally come to make America truly inclusive and equitable, how do we do it? Whose job is it to reverse white supremacy policies at every level, at every institution, placed intentionally into the Constitution itself? That's a lot to unpack. And to unpack that, we have the author, Miss Diane Chido. She's going to work to answer those questions. Now, the U.S. Army contracted Miss Chido to explore the Army's role in Reconstruction in 2017. She's going to discuss her newly released book on this topic and explore needed solutions. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Speggen and I'm the Vice President at the JES and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Now joining us here is the aforementioned author, Ms. Diane Chido, to discuss her aforementioned book, U.S. Army's Effectiveness in Reconstruction According to the Guiding Principles of Stabilization, which is in bookstores now. Now, before we dive into her presentation, a little bit more about the presenter. Diane Chido is the founder of the Erie-based research firm DC Analytics and a political science instructor at Gannon University. Recently returned from a 3-year contract as the Security and Intelligence Policy Advisor to the U.S. Army's Peacekeeping and Stability Operations Institute, PKSOI. She has been applying her 25 plus years of expertise in supporting post-conflicts and fragile societies to Erie's current challenges. She has published and lectured widely on governance, security, intelligence, sociocultural, and economic development topics, and possesses a master's degree in science and applied intelligence analysis and a master's of arts in Russian language. Now, folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments to keep this conversation going and to stay engaged. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, visit our website, jeserie.org, and be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Ms. Diane Chido, thank you for joining us for this discussion. Thank you for writing the book. Thank you for being here to present on that book. We're excited to have you.
Thank you very much, Ben. I'm thrilled to be here. I really appreciate all the support that Jefferson has given me on my research over the years. And this is a little bit of a continuation of my work on stabilization. So for those of you who have already seen my 5-part series or my introductory series in 2018, then you'll be a little bit familiar with some of the themes that we're going to discuss here, but now in the historical context of Reconstruction. There's a lot to unpack, like Ben said, so I'm going to go fast without going too fast so you can't keep up, because I really do want to get to some of those questions. So let's get started. Okay, so stabilization. The Army, the US government has been doing stability operations since the dawn of the Republic. And we've done it so many times that every time we come up with a new name for it. However, every new administration says we don't do nation building and fails to plan or resource for it. So we find ourselves in these weird wars of the flea, or my favorite, personal favorite, military operations other than war, or MUTWA. And Reconstruction was just one of these things, except the difference is it took place in the United States. So the Stabilization Assistance Review was the government's first attempt to try to put what we do in stabilization into doctrine. But it was a unique doctrine because it wasn't just for the Army, it was for the entire whole of government. So defense, state, USAID, every other agency that might have to help. And they basically stated that the purpose of post-combat stabilization operations is these key issues: consolidate security gains or battlefield wins, reducing levels of local instability. So it's not just about what happens at the nation state level, but what happens throughout the space where stabilization is taking place. Reducing, working with local partners. So local partners are critical in these efforts. If we just try to go and impose stabilization, we don't end up developing the relationships and the local buy-in that we call the host nation ownership that's needed to make these successful and sustainable. And we need to provide legitimate and responsive government, not just the kind that looks like ours, for instance, but that's truly responsive to the conditions of the people on the ground. So the key takeaway is that it's not just enough to win the battle. We can tell, all our history books tell us that the Union won the Civil War, but we must help our local partners secure the peace by using every instrument of our national power to secure that peace. So many of you who have seen stabilization from me before have seen this strategic framework, and it does say for stabilization and reconstruction. It was created by PKSOI and the USIP during the toughest years of the Iraq War to try to understand what do we do when combat is over. You'll see that central gray sort of brain of the concept and cross-country principles, which talks about host nation ownership and capacity. I would submit that this is very much what was forgotten in the South because occupation was imposed. And two of the most important groups were the Southern elites, who were the major slaveholders, and women, and they were both left out of the process. The other elements of stabilization, first of all, they're supposed to be functioning together at about the same time, but you can't do everything at once. And the first thing you really need to do is establish a secure environment so that other things can happen. When people are only focused on their survival, they can't think about, voting. They can't think about getting to the grocery store, educating their kids, all of the other things that need to happen to make societies function. So the next level that you need to operate and focus on is providing stable governance and rule of law. Once those are institutionalized and essentially in place, you can start thinking about, creating a sustainable economy so people can feed their families, and about reconstructing the social networks that are so critical to sustainable peace. So let's close our eyes and give ourselves the scene of what was like in Reconstruction. The South was utterly ruined. You're talking about people that didn't have basic food, clothing, shelter. Maslow's hierarchy of needs were not being met. The railroads were demolished. There was rubble everywhere. Canals, all waterways were clogged with everything from dead livestock to rubble to bodies. Wells were poisoned. Dams had collapsed, so fields were full of salt. They had been scorched intentionally. You mainly are seeing only women, children, the elderly, the infirm, wandering the roadsides, trying to figure out how to find their next meal while trying to be safe in a chaotic environment. Unfortunately, so the U.S. government took the Army and sent them there to control the South, to occupy the South, right? And this is an area that's almost the size of like Western Europe. So it's an enormous undertaking for an exhausted military. Unfortunately, Army contracts were up around the same time, and they didn't necessarily want to have to re-up everybody because they had enormous war debts. So they were dealing with troops constantly mustering out for this reason and also being assigned to the Indian Wars in the West. And I refer to them that way because that's how the Army calls them. So keep in mind, when you watch the Ken Burns documentary about the Civil War and the one about the West, these things are happening at exactly the same time. Meanwhile, the railroads are being built. There's a lot going on for the Union government to be dealing with. So in order to pay for all these things, the Union government did some things they were going to regret later. And one of those things that we can understand initially is almost 2 months after the war was over, they sold off a vast number of cavalry horses to pay war debts. This drastically reduced security and the ability of the troops to move around. So one thing we also have to keep in mind is cotton, right? We always talk about cotton and slave owning together, and they do go completely hand in hand. This is because you will hear apologists talk about tariffs and all kinds of other things that were the catalyst for the Civil War. It was slavery. Top and bottom, it was slavery. The cotton trade was growing exponentially around the world. And in order to meet those demands, the cotton gin was one invention that came out at this time. It did automate the processing of cotton, but not the manual field extraction. A friend of mine a couple of years ago went on a road trip across the country with his sister and her kids, and she pulled over in a cotton field. And they actually went and picked some cotton so the kids would have some idea of a frame of reference for all of this. A cotton is very sticky and it's very spiny. So it stabs your fingers while you're trying to pull it apart. It sticks to your fingers as you pull it out of the bowl and try to put it into your basket. And it's very, very hard work. Nobody had gloves. Nobody cared that their fingers were bleeding. And they were out in the sun, 16, 18 hours a day, every day without a break and without an end. So that has to be considered. But the thing is that the South had a different development trajectory than the North or the Middle states because the geography, topography, and the weather of the South made it perfect for growing crops, particularly cotton. So because of the need to create more product for export and the cotton gin being able to process it more quickly, there needed to be more land planted with cotton for manual labor to pick. And this is why the very powerful Southern states that already had an outsized role in the development of the first Constitution and the founding of the country, because they were large and powerful, they wanted to spread slavery into the new Western states. And so the problem with this is the idea of states' rights really grew out of this idea that states themselves and their populations should decide whether they would be slave or free. That's the real original concept of states' rights. We have to think about that in current conditions when we hear that term evoked. So again, after the war, think about the economic losses to the South. The way they looked at the slaves was they saw 4 million labor units that were lost from the economy. And then that plus the destruction, plus the loss of the whole economy is estimated to be about 5 years of GDP per capita. So the South was in pretty bad shape. At this time, you had soldiers returning from war. They weren't put on buses and driven home. They weren't flown home. They had to find their own way through wilderness sometimes, and they were already in bad shape. So the Southern veterans were making their way slowly across the country, and most of them were retaining their arms. They had little economic opportunity when they got home if their farms were in disarray, if their families were dispossessed, and they had to figure out what to do. In many cases along the way, they became criminals. Others became displaced by the war and became criminals. People raided military supply trains, farms, homes, just to find food and something to sell. So things like train and bank robberies, horse rustling came on the rise. Very exciting fodder for movies, but not so great if you're the guy whose horse is being taken. They preyed on wagon trains that were heading west. So all these things were happening and it was a real mess. So Reconstruction, again, is the army trying to impose order on this massive area. And Reconstruction needs to be looked at in 2 acts. The first is considered First Reconstruction. And this actually started taking place before the end of the war. So as a prescient leader, unlike many of our leaders in the contemporary period, President Lincoln started planning for what would come after in the middle of the war in 1863. At this time, you had a Republican-controlled Congress in the North, and you had Union troops occupying these former Confederate states. The second construction took place around 1870 until the end of Reconstruction. President Andrew Johnson, who was from Tennessee, a border state that was slaveholding, he was against slaveholding only because he was from a poor background. He had a few slaves, but he had a real beef with the major landowners and didn't want to see them getting ahead. That's why he wanted to see abolition. He talked tough about not going soft on the people who had caused the insurrection at the time. But then once he got into power and things moved along, he started pardoning and reinstating the secessionists with their land, their power, and the political influence that they had in the past. The plan that Lincoln came up with was so that as a certain proportion of a southern state, their voting eligible inhabitants, were able to determine. Okay, sorry. So in order to get the southern states back in the Union, lots of material. Once a certain number of the population declared their allegiance to the Union and agreed that slavery was abolished, then that state could hold its own constitutional convention. It could write its own new constitution and be allowed to rejoin the Union. Now that constitution had to include those two elements of allegiance and abolishment of slavery. And so gradually the states started coming back into the US Congress. And eventually by 1871, Georgia was the last to be seated back in the US House. Once this happened, the Congress eventually turned over to being Democratic controlled. And this is really where the changes started happening and the positive aspects of Reconstruction started being turned back. The Compromise of 1876 is often called the nastiest, dirtiest little backroom deal in American politics, where the Tilden Hayes presidential election was too close to call. It wasn't really clear what to do about this in the Constitution, so there was a bunch of discussion. Hayes decided, he promised the Southern Democrats that he would remove all the rest of the Union troops if he was declared the winner, and they went, all right, that's what we want, let's go for it. So he became president and the troops were taken out of the South. That was the end of Reconstruction. So to give us a little bit of a time frame, we only conducted Reconstruction from the end of the war, basically for about 12 years. If you look at this timeline, you can see Germany and Japan are bracketed in the center. And we know this example well because we had 4 years of war in World War II. And then we have had and consistently have over 75 years of stabilization operations where we've been supporting those countries and making sure they remain stable today. And they are. In our own country, however, we only had Reconstruction for 12 years and we didn't really complete the job. So we're seeing vestiges of it today. Let's explore that. So after the Civil War, there were 3 major constitutional amendments. The 13th, immediately following the war in 1865, that prohibited slavery. One clause we forget to note is that it says, except as a punishment for crime where the party was duly convicted. That is a caveat we have to keep in mind as we move forward here. The 14th, 3 years later, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. Great. It also prohibited anyone who had engaged in secession, who had held public office before the Civil War, from holding public office ever again in perpetuity. Another little caveat that came back to hurt us a little bit is, unless a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress rescinded that prohibition, then they could get their jobs back. Remember, after 1870, when the states had come back, when the southern states had come back, that 2/3 majority was a possibility. The 15th Amendment in 1870 prohibited the denial of the right to vote on account of race or color or previous condition of servitude. Okay, great. Maybe there are other ways that this could be denied. We might see some creative legislating going on as we go ahead. So the Army's role in Reconstruction basically was essentially to provide security as well as basic needs like food to the ruined Southerners, to the ruined South. They had to protect and house and feed and provide care for all the estimated 4 million freed people that were former slaves now, on top of all of the other people in the South that were suffering. They needed help, and they organized contractors that came down from the South that were teachers, doctors, lawyers, all kinds of people that came down. They wanted to help. Some of them also wanted to get paid. They helped with literacy and civic education, job training, helping people who'd never worked for money before understanding labor contracts. They had to also, at the same time, the army had to install leaders. So they needed governors, mayors, local leaders. They needed judges and magistrates, police chiefs. But all these people, if they weren't deemed and vetted to be loyal to the Union and anti-slavery, they were just going to return their area of jurisdiction to the way things had been before. So this was a really arduous process. The Corps of Engineers was super busy at this point. They were clearing waterways, they were repairing roads, railroads, buildings, so that commerce like banks and all kinds of things, so that everything could return to normal or be improved. So something that a lot of people aren't aware of that we could do an entire one of these on is the Freedmen's Bureau, which was established in 1865 specifically to help unlanded white people and particularly freed slaves. So General Sherman was friends with General Oliver Otis Howard, who was put in charge of this. And he told him, "I fear you will not succeed to fill 1/10 of the expectations of those who put you in this job. You have Hercules' task and you're not going to make it." By all accounts, he did fail, but by all accounts, he was the best person for the job. He was a pious, kind, compassionate man who really tried to do his best for the freed people. But the job was just beyond his ability, especially in the short time he was given. A lot of really good things happened in terms of improving the lives of freed people at this time. Families were not always able to stay together, frequently not, obviously, as people could be sold off, spouses, children, families searched for loved ones. They were able to find each other. The Freedmen's Bureau helped with this. There was a lot of abandoned property for various reasons, including some landowners just leaving because the situation was too chaotic, some people looking for opportunity in the West. So a lot of this abandoned property was distributed to Black families. So we know the whole 40 acres and a mule, yes, that happened, but some of it was rescinded later. It didn't happen on the scale that needed to happen to really give people opportunity. Schools were federally funded. People in the South didn't have the access to public schools that we are accustomed to thinking about today. Wealthy people had tutors or they sent their kids to private schools. But these federally funded public schools that were open to white and Black students no matter what were really an innovation. By 1880, 34% of Black students were able to go to school. So this was really a big deal. Another really important thing that we still see today in a positive way is the Morrill Land Act in 1862, which provided land set aside in each Union state before the war ended, you see in 1862, to develop colleges that would train people in agricultural science and engineering so that they could help rebuild the South. Another one of Lincoln's innovations before the war ended. These were continued and expanded into Southern states as they became part of the Congress again. Once they rejoined the Union, they could get these land grant schools. Penn State is one of these. Many of them became what we see today as historically Black colleges and universities. And they've done a really good job educating people who might not have had education otherwise. There were also hundreds of towns where Black civic life and prosperity abounded. We've talked recently in the public about Tulsa, about Black Wall Street. This was really the founding of those kinds of places where Black life really flourished. Sometimes they were in proximity to hostile neighbors where they needed to have sort of a town militia, but other times they were left to themselves and they were able to really flourish. At the same time, we started seeing Black representation in the US Congress for the first time. So in 1870 to 87, we had 6 Black representatives in Congress and 1 senator. Unfortunately, this was too many for the Old South. Reconstruction, as we know, went into 2 acts. The Compromise of 1877 basically ended it, and then that became the heyday for the Old South to celebrate its redemption, as it likes to call it, the coming back to what it had been before. So from the end of the war, we talk about violence that took place, and we have to understand it was political violence. It wasn't random, it wasn't angry. It was specifically targeted to reduce Black and pro-union political participation at the polls and to prevent people from exercising their rights. It was applied judiciously and it was applied with maximum terror effect. So in 1870, we see the beginning of the Jim Crow period. Virginia law made it illegal for Black and white children to go to school together. This began school segregation. The federal government saw that these changes were coming and that things were happening in the states that didn't really go along with what they had hoped for the outcome of Reconstruction. So they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This prohibited discrimination in public accommodations. So we already had laws that were prohibiting discrimination in state or federally run places, but the states were starting to roll these back. The Civil Rights Act was an attempt to do this in hotels and theaters and other places where there's transportation, on land and water transportation, and other places where people might want to gather, like theaters. 1877, again, ended Reconstruction. So you see in 1875, they're starting to realize that there's going to be problems and do what they can at the federal level. By 1877, the end of 1877, the map on your right shows you where the Army was still situated, where Black people could go for security and for services. The map on the left shows you the larger areas where the Army controlled the South. So there was a lot more zones of access and security at the immediate end of the war. And by 1877, those had receded exponentially. So this also reminds us that there are a lot of Army bases, Army posts, in the South, many of whom eventually were named after Confederate heroes. The Army, the Joint Staff, the Defense Department is working right now to change those names. We'll see a little bit later why that's so important. So with redemption and Jim Crow, we saw the things that we're familiar with. Black migration west began because people realized they couldn't get a fair shake in the South. That Civil Rights Act of 1875 that tried to undo this before it happened, well, 1883, it was ruled unconstitutional. The Supreme Court said that the 14th Amendment only prohibited states from discriminating, not individual citizens, which is why hotel and theater owners and restaurant owners could make their own determinations on who they would serve, and who they would refuse. We hear echoes of this after the 2015 Supreme Court decision to rescind the ban on gay marriage, where the famous hapless bakery owner refused to make a cake for a gay wedding, right? So it's about citizens being able to make the choice about their own business, and this became widespread. From 1890 to 1908, Southern states adopted new constitutions and voting laws specifically designed to disenfranchise Black voters. They were able to use things like poll taxes and literacy tests and other kinds of ingenious ways to keep people from being able to vote, in addition to violent intimidation. By 1921, Woodrow Wilson had institutionalized segregation in the federal service. So it was no longer possible for Black Americans to serve in the federal government, and the District of Columbia was completely segregated by the end of World War I. One of the very worst parts of Jim Crow that we have seen continue to this date is the convict lease program. Dr. Henry Louis Gates has talked about this extensively in his Stony the Road Reconstruction 4-part series on PBS, and I highly recommend that you take a look at it. He calls it slavery by another name. It's difficult to consider it anything else. So imagine 4 million souls trying to figure out what to do with all this great freedom they've been given, but no clue about exactly how to go about sustaining their families or trying to contribute to civic life or just figure out where to get their next meal. This resulted in an increase in vagrancy laws that may have been on the books, or new ones were instituted across the South. These led to fines, which people couldn't pay, which led to imprisonment. So you found poor white prisoners, but predominantly Black prisoners, rented out as cheap labor in numerous industries, not just in the cotton fields. So mining, logging, railroads, lots of places where there was dirty work to be done. They were treated inhumanely, and they were literally worked to death. This convict lease program provided so much income for the individual states themselves that, for instance, by 1883, Alabama's convict leasing program constituted 10% of the total state revenues. By 1898, it was 73%. Very, very difficult to roll back something like this that's so lucrative for the states. In the 1980s, we saw private prisons flourishing, and this, of course, requires a quota of prisoners to maintain their bottom line or their profit margin. So this has resulted in a lot of laws that have increasingly incarcerated people unevenly, particularly minorities, and especially Black men. So we also see today the riots in Ferguson The Department of Justice report about the riots talks about what led up to them. And yes, there was a single shooting, but before that, there was so much discontent because police forces were unevenly applying fines for things like walking with a swagger down the street, for instance, things that were very clearly targeting certain people in town. And when they couldn't pay their fines, they essentially resurrected debtors' prison. So people were really stuck. And across the southern states, and in other states too, minor drug offenses are considered felonies. These can result in permanent disenfranchisement. So if you commit one of these crimes, you can never vote again. And there are some states that are trying to say, well, if you pay all your fines when you get out of prison, then you can vote again. But that is really difficult for a lot of people. And there are other ways to continue this disenfranchisement because of the way that people are expected to vote. They don't want to tip the balance of power against a certain party. So a couple of other acts that are worth mentioning include the Posse Comitatus Act, because it came to the forefront again during the January 6th Capitol riot. This was in 1878, and it was meant to uphold civilian control of US armed forces, which is already enshrined in the Constitution. It was an intentional backlash against the Army's job to maintain public order as the Southern white population was increasingly asserting itself and becoming more violent. It prohibits the Army specifically from conducting law enforcement activities, arrests, investigations, and search and seizure on US soil, except when there's a federally declared martial law. This relates to the controversial use of federal troops to control the Black Lives Matter protests in the summer of 2020. Some would say that this overrides Posse Comitatus. And then also the military's comments about being concerned about optics with armed military units operating in Washington during the riots, and the whole problem with chain of command in trying to get support for the Capitol Police and the local police forces to stop the riots. So at this time, of course, we're aware that the Ku Klux Klan was rising. In December of 1865, it started to appear already that soon after the war. Nathan Bedford Forrest is considered to be the creator. It started in a town in Georgia, claiming to be law and order support where the Army was unable to maintain security. There is a story that it was just a couple of drunk guys that stole some sheets off a line and decided to walk around like ghosts and scare Black people in town. I'm pretty sure it wasn't just a prank because they really grew. And Nathan Bedford Forrest, as a railway engineer, was able to move from place to place, serving as a communication conduit, because the Klan was never an organized national group. It was disparate groups in various places, and this way he could help them coordinate and communicate tactics and activities. By the time 1871 came along, President Grant worked tirelessly to try to stop the activities of the Klan. They got the Ku Klux Act passed in Congress, which allowed Army commanders at that time to conduct operations against them by declaring martial law and suspending habeas corpus. The Supreme Court then declared the act constitutional just over 10 years later. So this, again, along with Posse Comitatus, really limits what the government can ask the Army to do on domestic soil. As Jim Crow grew in the southern states, and the US Senate, which was controlled by the Democrats at the time, continued passing laws to limit the civil rights, it wasn't a big deal because the Klan objectives were already being met. The things they wanted to have done with political intimidation and stuff were unnecessary because the laws were doing it for them. This still resurges periodically to intimidate as Black Americans reassert their rights, and now often other minorities. We can see this visually here from this Confederate monument building timeline that the Southern Poverty Law Center has put together. When you see the really huge spike there with the red and the blue peaks, that's around the time between 1900 and 1920 when Black Americans were really starting to reassert their rights and try to overthrow the Jim Crow laws. These were intentionally created to intimidate. If you look at the beginning of the timeline, that's the end of the Civil War. And people like to say, oh, they were commemorating the war fallen. Not really. The war was long over when this movement got going. And when we talk about removing Confederate statues or names from buildings, we really need to go back and look at the history and understand what was the purpose of building this monument in the first place. And typically it's a good one to take down. People are particularly concerned about the ones at Gettysburg and on battlefields. That may be a different conversation, but most of the other ones in the public space, you can see here when they were constructed. So what changed? So these moments when Black Americans were reasserting their rights that they had been given at the end of the Civil War. And we must also recall that Black Americans had a lot more agency than we typically give them credit for in our literature and our culture, because they really had complex communication networks, often through churches. People knew how to get on the Underground Railroad, what to do when they were traveling on it. People knew how to find loved ones. There were things that were happening that we often discount. By 1892, Ida B. Wells started writing about lynching. It was a concerted campaign against this. The Tuskegee Institute has estimated that almost 3,500 Black people were lynched in the years up to 1951. In 1903, Du Bois published The Souls of Black Folk, which is considered a landmark book that made people start seeing Black people, white people see Black people as basically human and deserving of rights. 1909 was the establishment of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People. And in 1914, the United Negro Improvement Association became a really powerful grassroots movement. So some other things that were happening in society that caused change, that brought us to the civil rights era that we expect to come up now was World War I. You had 350,000 Black soldiers fighting for the US. Again, in World War II, 125,000. In the meantime, the women were given the right to vote, mostly wealthy white women, but it's a step forward. In 1948, Truman issued an executive order that ended segregation in the armed services, and this was the first movement toward some areas of affirmative action that started trying to level the playing field. In 1952, it was the first year the Tuskegee Institute reported there were no lynchings. And then, of course, Brown v. Education, the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act quickly followed. And then banks started recognizing an untapped account and mortgage market. So they started offering loans to Black professionals. In 1965, during the Civil Rights period, the Assistant Secretary of Labor, Daniel Moynihan, wrote a seminal work about the Negro family and realized the shortcomings in society that were still plaguing them. One of the main things was the need to make a decent living in order to actually be part of society. And this is where the ideas of affirmative action and some of the changes started to take place. These changes in banking rules and expanding their markets ended up gutting inner cities, as those who could move did move. It left fewer examples for children now that they didn't necessarily have lawyers and doctors and people of the professional class living next door. The Rotary Club a few years ago used to read at one of our elementary schools, and one of our Rotarians reported back that after he got done reading, the students gave him their condolences. He asked why, and he said he was just coming from work. Well, they had never seen a man in a suit during the day unless he was going to a funeral. So that kind of gives you an idea of the lack of aspiration that resulted from these demographic changes. Critics used this report to reinforce racist stereotypes because of the result of the lack of the nuclear family being able to be forged in slavery because of sale of family members, frankly. The more extended family organization that existed in Africa pre-slavery became the norm in our Black neighborhoods, where you have an aunt or a grandmother that's taking care of a bunch of different kids and a lot of different, you have more of a matriarchal society. These were considered to be loose family morals, and we needed to get back to the good Christian family concept, which resulted in a lot of social policies that ended up being very detrimental in the Black community. These departures caused businesses to leave, the property tax changed, leading to substandard schools, and all the things that we see today still. And this further eroded the middle class, again, not just in the South, but this also happened in the North as well. So we can sit here smugly and think about how the Southern people were such jerks. But in fact, as Black people moved north and started populating the cities, we started seeing a lot of the same kind of bigotry and the same kind of efforts to reduce their opportunities in the northern cities as well. We've also seen this here in Erie. So this is a 1923 picture of a cross burning in Erie, a Klan rally of sorts. This is the famous redlining map that was brought to us by the Erie Reader, someone, an organization I know Ben won't mind me plugging, but they've done phenomenal work in the last few years, really bringing to light the problems of racial disparity in Erie. And I highly recommend that you go back and read some of these great articles. This is a 1937 map that local realtors openly used to make sure that the nice neighborhoods stayed nice and that nice white people didn't move into the wrong neighborhoods. It really made a big difference in property values and in people's opportunities. We know that this was the rally in Harrisburg that Jay Adams organized to try to change the funding process for our public schools, to try to help the students that are going to the less quality of schools because we don't have the resources. And then on a very positive note, this is the 2020 event where Erie white churches actually acknowledge their own longstanding role in white supremacy. So we are seeing positive changes in our own community and across the country, but these kinds of events are wonderful, but it's the work that comes next that really needs to be emphasized. And it's difficult to do that unless we understand the historical roots of how we got to where we are today. I think I'm done.
Diane, I want to thank you for that. That was a lot of ground to cover. No easy feat trying to read a book here in a half an hour to 40 minutes. So I thank you for that. There's plenty to unpack. So I do want to thank you for going through that quickly, but still thoroughly. And where I want to start is I want to start back at the beginning for you. Take us back to 2017 when the Army calls you up and says, we'd like to contract you to explore stabilization and the Army's role in a post-Civil War Reconstruction. Clearly you said yes, but what led you to say yes? What drew you to this research? And here we are 4 years later. What got you interested? What made you say yes? Why did you want to take this on? Because this is a big task.
It is a big task. And frankly, I didn't know anything about the period. And so it was a much bigger task than I thought, and quite embarrassing because I was surrounded by quote unquote Civil War experts everywhere I looked. Down at the War College. So it was actually my second year on this contract. I had sold my house in Erie and I was kind of stuck in Carlisle. So it was good that they kept me for another year. And the idea was to kind of figure out the stabilization principles that I showed in that early graphic. Do they really work? We've been looking at them for 10 years and trying to apply them to various post-conflict societies. And as I said, post-traumatic societies, as I tried to apply it to Erie last year in 2018. And it occurred to me, we keep trying to look at the lens of Somalia or Sudan or some places that are still in conflict and in dynamic conditions today. So it's not really that useful because their conditions are constantly changing. So we don't know if they work or not. So I thought, let's look back at where we have 150 years of outcomes and focus first on the Army's role. How well did the Army do when it was actually allowed to do the job that it was tasked to do? But at the same time, it was constantly being under-resourced and further tasked, which is something that we discovered is always the case in stabilization operations throughout history and everywhere in the world. So that was really what we wanted to look at. And I had a lot of Civil War historians to draw upon, but as I started talking to them, I discovered few of them really knew that much about the Reconstruction period. So it was a really big slog for me to try to understand all of this. Fortunately, I had narrowed it to the Army's role, but as I started researching, I couldn't leave it there. And the second Reconstruction period and the aftermath, they were showing up on television with Dylan Roof shooting, the Dylan Roof shooting in the church, and the rise of the pictures that we're seeing of more people using Confederate flags, and all of this was just happening in real time. So it was impossible to just maintain the focus on the Army's role. And we really had to look at how this affected society long-term when stabilization ultimately failed, because we have a lot of societal problems today that can relate directly back to it.
And Diana, I want to pick up right in one of the things you said there, because I think that ties nicely to an audience question in the curiosity of why do we focus so much? Because you had mentioned there are a lot of Civil War historians and scholars that focus on the war itself, but not so much the after the war. And so this person's curious, why we don't focus more on what follows war, and we focus our attention on the wars themselves, the battles, the times, the years, the bookend. It started this year, it ended this year. We don't think about the next chapter. Why is that we don't focus more on what follows out of conflict?
It's often said that in the public mind, war is more popular than peace. It's a lot to do with voter fatigue, for instance. In the North, people felt as if, okay, look, this has been going on long enough. This is costing resources. The war's over. Slavery's ended. Let's move on. We're moving west. We're doing all this stuff. We're building factories. There's a lot going on right here. Why do we have to worry about this problem anymore? All the states are back in the Union. The South is having, if it's having any problems, it's their own problem, or So that's a lot of why. Also, you have to remember at that time, communication wasn't quite as what it was today. So people didn't really understand what was happening. And when we look back at the Jim Crow period, it happened pretty fast, but it also crept along in quiet places. And then it just became the thing that those people down there did. And we like to think that the North wrote the history books because they were the victor. But in fact, women mobilized to change our view of, it's often said that the Union won the war and the South won the peace. And so a lot of the things that happened since then are uncomfortable. And people don't really like to think about the historical roots of things and just think, well, this is how it is. And I have to go to work, and then I have to come home and make dinner, and then I have to clean my house on Saturday. I think that's a lot of why people haven't really worried about this period so much. Does that make sense?
It does, and I think there are two important things out of there. One is the idea of trying to capture the South as a monolith. It's not. It's complex, and I think you touched well on that throughout the presentation. But you also mentioned, a fascinating. I thought a fascinating part of your book, and I think this could be a program unto itself. The role women played in stabilization. You talk about that in the book. That stood out to me. What stood out to you when you were researching that and found that?
So PKSOI was at the forefront of something called Women, Peace, and Stability. Women in Peace and Security, excuse me. And people often think that means, oh, invite a woman to the peace table. It doesn't. It means that conflict often takes place because of women. We see a lot of conflict in Africa, for instance, because men can't afford bride prices, so they just kidnap them, for instance. There's a lot of ways in which women are integrally involved in conflict. Women are often the ones who control the marketplaces, right? And so when they are unhappy, they're the ones that start protests in many places. They're a lot of the reason that Nigeria got its independence from Great Britain, as a matter of fact. Women are critically important to what happens in securing peace and in what happens in ending conflict. So the role of women in this case was absolutely enormous, and they were left out of the whole thing. So they found a role for themselves. While the men were busy legislating and changing the laws and oppressing Black people, the women were still angry. They had lost their husbands, their sons, their fathers, and they were still very angry at the North. So they're really the ones responsible for propagating what we call the lost cause myth, which is essentially that the South was right. They lost their way of life, and it was because of those terrible people in the North that misunderstood them. They didn't actually lose the war because they fought more valiantly and gallantly than the North did. They just had greater numbers. And this has really been propagated effectively and touches a lot of people even today. And the way the women did that was in two major ways, but in lots of other ways. And I agree, we could make this another program. Let's do it. And it's the anti-women's history thing. I'm just kidding. But the women's role is important. So as we know, Robert E. Lee's property was turned into Arlington National Cemetery, but that was only for fallen Union soldiers. There was nowhere to bury Confederate soldiers, and they were left on the battlefield to rot. The women were furious, and they organized their own corps and their own donations to go out and find the corpses and bring them back and create cemeteries. They created memorial. They're the first ones that had Memorial Day parades. They created the memory of the Southern soldier. And then they also moved into other areas that are really important. Like they started controlling the history books in the South, which is another reason that it's touchy to talk about the Reconstruction period, because there are many people who will jump up and say, that's not the history. I will disagree with that.
And I think that takes us in a whole different direction of, he or she who holds the pen tells the history, tells the story, how we tell ourselves stories, what we tell of our own history to ourselves, and how there are variations on that. But I want to wrestle with some of the big questions that I'd gone through in the introduction to the program to lead up here, because I think what your book does so well, Diane, is that it works at answering, how did we get here? And I think that's a big question for a lot of folks these days, is how did we get here? You know, here we are in 2021, and we're still talking about a divided nation when it comes to our approach to racism, and the fact that we have a Black Lives Matter movement here in the 21st century, and that, you know, we had to go through civil rights 100 years after the Civil War. So how did we get here? And it's a really long here between the Civil War to now. And some of those questions, just to refresh the viewers, were, you know, we were looking at, if this is the moment, if the moment has finally come to make America truly inclusive and equitable, how do we do it? And then whose job is it to reverse white supremacist policies at every level of every institution placed intentionally into the Constitution? And I can't help but think there to a work that the JES had published by Dr. Paris Baker, that, you know, declared a section of the work declared the system is not broken. You know, the system is designed this way, and getting people to acknowledge that and think about that when it comes to equity building. So what do we do if the moment's finally here? How do we do it to make America more inclusive, to make it truly inclusive and equitable? And whose job is it? I don't see us sending the army back in to stabilize. How do we get here, Diane? What do we do?
Pussy comitatus, you can't do that. Sorry. No, you're absolutely right. And I love your comment about what Paris had to say, because I started this project in 2017 with the best of intentions and with very great ignorance about my own history, right? About our own history. And so I've learned a lot in the last 5 years about these exact questions. And I expect my thinking has evolved so much that I expect I'll learn even more in the next 5. So my answer is based on today, right? My understanding of this problem today. So I may be wrong, but this is how I see it now from all this thinking. I went to the Juneteenth celebration, not last year, unfortunately, but the year before. And I was listening to a speaker, and it suddenly occurred to me, because I've been one of these ignorant people walking around saying the system is broken, the system is broken. And I suddenly had my own epiphany moment where I thought, oh my God, no, it's not. It's working the way it was crafted. And so that moment happening in an individual, I would hope it would make you never be the same as you were the moment before, where you realize the system was made this way on purpose. And we may say, okay, well, it happened in the South and Jim Crow's over. But, and to some extent it is. I mean, we have to give ourselves that much. But I still think you're going to hear people, and I have heard it recently, I didn't own slaves. How is this my problem? This isn't my fault. I'm not a racist. But as long as people are benefiting from the system that came from before, the job belongs to all of us. Now, I can tell a friend who's Italian, there weren't really any Italians in the United States during the slave period. So you're right, your people didn't own slaves. But as a European American, you are still afforded certain privileges that come with that whiteness, which now we see Italians as white. We didn't in the past, right? And so you have a responsibility to do something about it. And there are different levels of responsibility depending on our capabilities and our positions, obviously. There's legislation, there's policy changes that need to happen. Like we talked about with the new the new criminal justice reform that looks at changing the rules of bail bond, right? New recruiting and training and ways of using the police, the ways of looking at incarceration. You know, you have a prison built in a rural area where there's not a lot of opportunity is a great opportunity for the folks there to get jobs, right? And so they might consider, well, yeah, I'm a law and order person. You know, nobody's going to say they're not. And so the legislation that has to go into place to make sure that those quotas are kept up in prisons, and they're targeting certain people that won't be noticed because they're taken off the streets, that won't make the headlines, then, you know, people are supporting that legislation. Judges are approving those sentences. It's really that systemic that if you're in those kinds of positions or in an advocacy role, you have a job to do. But if you're just a regular person or you're a teacher, for instance, you have to teach critical thinking, you have to teach digital literacy, because there's too much disinformation that's intended to divide our society. And we don't have the skills as a society to dig through it and find the real information. We're intentionally being divided. And if you discover that you misunderstood something or you are seeing something in a new way, it's your job to share it with someone else.
And I really appreciate your use of disinformation there, because I think it's so important today when we say words matter, and understanding the weight they carry, the difference between misinformation, we unintentionally got something wrong, versus disinformation, intentionally sowing discord with information that is incorrect, to create a divisive moment culturally between people. So I really value your use of the word there. I don't think this would be a book about the military without some acronyms in it. And one of the ones that I want to point to is DDRR. So in the book, you write a theme throughout this study is also the lack of the follow through post conflict in completing the disarmament, demobilization, reintegration, and reconciliation, the DDRR aspects of ending conflict. And earlier you just gave some credit to how we have gotten things done. We've moved the needle. So what is the most important lesson that the post-Civil War Reconstruction taught us that we've learned and applied out of that? And then on the other side, what's the most important lesson we're still trying to learn? What did you find in your research?
Well, I think the fact that the Freedmen's Bureau knew how important it was to focus on basic education and literacy, and civics education. That was something that was right out of the gate. You feed people, you clothe them, you house them, you get them medical care, and then you teach them to read. And that was also one of the really important things that the slaveholders insisted on not allowing happen in most cases, because they knew it could lead to insurrection, right? They knew it could lead to people recognizing their own condition and that it shouldn't be that way, and creating a new identity as something else that would require the destruction of the old world. And they lived in constant terror of this. So we need to remember that lesson, that the need for literacy, there's something I talk about a lot from the example of Rwanda, for instance, after the genocide. One of the programs, there's still a discussion about the quality of governance in Rwanda, because the president is kind of a straw man. But you kind of have to hold things together after a cataclysm like that. And one of the things that they did in Rwanda to develop reconciliation and reintegration of their society was they had these work groups of people that went out and built infrastructure together. And it would be someone who had committed some aspect of genocide, someone who had been victimized by it somehow, and another person. And the three of them would go out and have to see each other and spend every day together. Learn to see each other as people. But you couldn't get these jobs until you passed a literacy test. So people had to learn how to read their own information and not just believe that their neighbor told them that, Tutsis have horns and a tail and they believe it's true, And so this is why this is so important. This education and this critical thinking is so important. And I think that's something that has been learned in some stabilization operations and something that was known in Reconstruction and was striving for. One of the things I think you asked, what was one of the things that we're still learning? I think it's the same lesson.
They're one and the same, and we're almost out of time. And I'm glad we've already lined up at least one more program out of this. There are many more to come out of this, out of your book, Diane. And I want to encourage people to go and get that. U.S. Army's Effectiveness in Reconstruction According to the Guiding Principles of Stabilization. But final question here: if folks are to take away one thing from the presentation, and I'm going to tell them to go get the books, you take away many things, but here in the presentation, if they take away one thing, when you were finished with this, what did you hope people would get reading your book and then hearing you today in this presentation? What do you hope they take away? One thing.
It's a little trite, but you can't overstate the old adage that those who fail to know their history are doomed to repeat it. That's all there is to it. I mean, really, we have failed to remember our own history in this country, and we have used scapegoats to deal with that instead of actually looking at what we have built as a result of it and thinking about how we need to dismantle and alter it and reform it.
Well, Ms. Diane Chido, I want to thank you for helping us learn our history through a discussion focusing on your book, author of U.S. Army's Effectiveness in Reconstruction, according to the guiding principles of stabilization. Thank you, thank you, thank you for sharing that, sharing your knowledge, your expertise, the time, energy, and effort you took to do the book, write the book, get it out, and then have this conversation with us. Thank you for being here in conversation.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much, Ben. And thank you, anybody who's out there.
And of course, yes, thank you, the folks out there watching along at home, whether you've tuned in live to watch this on the JES Facebook page, or you're catching a later broadcast or listening to a later broadcast of this. We thank you. These programs don't happen without you, the audience. We're grateful for you. Diane, for those folks interested in getting a copy of the book, where do we point them?
We point them right to, you can look up Chido and Palgrave here, PALGRAVE.com, palgrave.com.
Excellent.
And you can get it as an ebook or a hard copy.
Excellent, convenient, easy. Thank you. Palgrave.com. Folks, a friendly reminder to stream other JES digital programs on demand. Head over to our website, jeserie.org. We'll put a link to that book as well, where you can get it there. There you're also going to find details about upcoming JES programs, as well as a wide range of publications, from quick timely reads to reports, essays, and more, all free to download. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Speggen. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.